Side when I'm tired. Well, falls by the wayside when I'm a bit tired. It's editing, so I'm sorry if it's a bit long. But yeah, I'll just pray. Thank you, Lord, that you understand that we are dust, and I just thank you that you are so loving and understanding towards us. And I just pray you bless the words that you want to come to life today, and just help people to receive what you want them to receive. Amen. So we're carrying on in Acts today, just carrying on in our normal series, and we're starting with, so I'll start by reading it from the New Living Translation, and we're on Acts 25, verses 1 to 12. 3 days after Festus arrived in Caesarea to take over his new responsibilities, he left for Jerusalem, where the leading priests and other Jewish leaders met with him and made their accusations against Paul. They asked Festus as a favor to transfer Paul to Jerusalem, planning to ambush and kill him on the way. But Festus replied that Paul was at Caesarea and he himself would be returning there soon. So he said, "Those of you in authority can return with me. If Paul has done anything wrong, you can make your accusations." About 8 or 10 days later, Festus returned to Caesarea, and on the following day he took his seat in court and ordered that Paul be brought in. When Paul arrived, the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem gathered around and made many serious accusations they couldn't prove. Paul denied the charges. "I am not guilty of any crime against the Jewish laws or the temple or the Roman government," he said. Then Festus, wanting to please the Jews, asked him, "Are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there?" But Paul replied, "No, this is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well I am not guilty of harming the Jews. If I have done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I am innocent, no one has the right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar." Festus conferred with his advisors and then replied, "Very well, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go." Hopefully this is going to work. Yep, maybe. Okay. So in this passage, we meet Festus, and he's Felix's replacement. And we've heard Paul speak about Felix recently. So Festus is the new governor of Judea. And you might recall that Felix held Paul in prison for 2 years after he was rescued from a riot in Jerusalem and then sent to Caesarea for safety. Now, Felix did not find him guilty of the charges brought against him, but he didn't release him either. And he kept him in custody, partly to keep the Jews happy, partly because he thought he might get some money out of Paul. You know, he'd learned that Paul had been doing a collection for the believers in Jerusalem, and he wondered whether maybe he could get something out of it. So when Felix leaves his post, then he leaves Paul in prison still, and his case unresolved, to try to stay in the Jews' good books, because he's actually been called up on maladministration. So he's in trouble, so he wants to just curry favor. So Festus, the new governor, he's inherited Felix's problem. And like Felix before him, and if you think about it, like Pontius Pilate, who's another governor we've heard about, he has this uneasy role of being Rome's representative and enforcer amongst the Jews. And this meant that he had to, on one side, keep the Jews happy, because they could accuse him, they could make complaints against him, as they had for Felix. But also he had to keep them in line. He had to keep the law and order of the area so that things would run smoothly for Rome. And the added complication, of course, in Paul's case is that he is a Roman citizen, so he has more rights than many. So Festus's diplomacy and leadership is really put to the test in this, his first challenge. And what really struck me when I read this passage first was just how immediately he has to deal with the problem of Paul. You know, it shows just how much of a priority Paul was. Paul must have been for the Jews, because his case was brought up so quickly when the new covenant came in, and the case was heard. Festus went to Jerusalem, but as soon as he was back in Caesarea, the very next day he heard the case. And we learned from the request by the Jews for Paul to be moved back to Jerusalem again that they were still pursuing that plan to kill him, which they'd had 2 years ago. They hadn't forgotten him. And it may have been that the people who had, people had made a vow to kill him, to not eat or drink before they killed him 2 years ago. It may have been that they'd worked out some kind of way around this vow, where at the first opportunity they were going to try to carry it out. And as we've seen, while following Paul's journey through Acts, this is not the first plot against his life. He's had many plots against his life. So what is it that made Paul just so offensive? The fact that he was a priority to the Jews 2 years after being taken out of circulation just shows how provocative he must have been to them. But why? I was thinking about it, and I was thinking it was because he was unashamedly making the case for Jesus. And as is still true today, Jesus is the answer to all of life's questions. He's the answer to the Jewish laws and faith, and he's the answer to history's and today's questions about suffering and heartache and injustice. He is the answer, but he is the answer that many people do not want to accept. I think this came up in our recent Alpha course. There's a great quote from C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. And he says, I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So what C.S. Lewis is saying here is that Jesus is either everything he says he is, or his claims are untrue, which means he was either mad or he was evil, to have made those kind of false claims. Now, we, of course, have the privilege of knowing him, and we know him to be everything that he said he was. As Peter said, he has the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that he is the Holy One of God. But for those Jews who didn't accept him, he was either a madman or a brazen liar. And because his answers to their challenges had been so good, they'd been too wise for them to pass him off as a madman. So they had to decide that he was evil. And this is just so sad, because here was Jesus, who was the answer to all their prayers and all of life's problems, and they wouldn't accept him. Because when they saw true justice and true love and true life, then they didn't really want it after all. It demanded too much of them. It demanded that they repent too, that they change their ways too, that they humble themselves too. And they just weren't prepared to do that. I'm reading the book of Jeremiah at the moment, and he faced a similar reaction to Jesus and to Paul, and so did so many others of the prophets. People kept calling on the name of the Lord to save them, but they weren't willing to give up on their own way in order to follow God's way. And they didn't accept his help or his guidance or his truth when he sent it. and he sent it so often through so many prophets, through the apostles, and even through his own son. And I think the same thing happens today. Jesus is the answer and the remedy to all the suffering and injustice and heartache we see. But when accepting him requires that we give up on our own way to follow his, then it's seen as too much to ask. And people miss out on the only true satisfaction they could ever really have in life. And it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking on behalf of God and Jesus. But it's so heartbreaking on the part for them, the people who are missing out on this. They are the ones really to be pitied. Now, thankfully for Paul, Festus doesn't go along with the Jews' suggestion of sending Paul to Jerusalem, so the plot to kill him is scuppered once again. It does go to show what a tricky balance the governor had to strike, however, because later on Festus does try to appease the Jews by offering to asking Paul whether he is willing to go to Jerusalem to be tried. But of course, because Paul's a Roman citizen, he has the right to decline, and he does. And actually, it's suggested in one of the parts that I was reading that maybe Festus already knew that Paul wouldn't agree. So he decided if he asked, it made him look good to the Jews, but he wasn't actually going to have to do anything about it. So Paul has a hearing with Festus in Caesarea, and the Jews bring the same kind of charges that they brought against him again and again, all throughout Paul's missionary journeys and then in Jerusalem. And Paul's defense is the same. I think it's obviously summarized here because it's quite short, summarized by Luke because we have heard it quite a few times. So Paul's answer here is simply, I am not guilty of any crime against the Jewish laws or the temple or the Roman government, or in some translations, or against Caesar. So here we come back to Paul's reputation for controversy. Paul's testimony about Jesus reflects Jesus's own claim that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And as I said earlier, Jesus was the answer to the hope that the Jewish people had held on to for so long. And yet they didn't recognize him for who he was. He fulfilled so many prophecies, and yet because he didn't fit with their preconceptions and their reading of the law, then he wasn't accepted. He was seen as a blasphemer. But Paul went through all the proper channels as he preached Jesus. He went to the synagogues first to preach. He knew the law inside and out as a Pharisee, and he could explain how Jesus fulfilled the scriptures. But because he wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear, they refused to listen to him. And they decided, because they couldn't stay on the fence about this, they decided to stand in opposition. And then there's, the claim about him being against the temple. Again, we've looked at this before. He knew the laws. He would not have wound up the Jews in that way to have taken a Gentile into the temple. And it was on hearsay that he was accused of this. I wonder how much what Jesus had said about the temple being taken down had been heard by others. I wonder whether they thought, well, they are against the temple. But the truth is that believers, until the temple fell, the believers carried on. While they were accepted in the temple, they carried on worshipping there. They obviously realized that true worship was in spirit and in truth from then on, but that didn't mean they went against the temple, as God intended the temple to be. And from Paul's response to the Jews here, it's obviously that they've added another charge. They've said that Paul had broken Roman law, or that he was guilty of crime against Caesar. And again, you can see that this is a trumped up charge, because Paul knows the Roman laws so well, like he does the Jewish laws, that he instructs his captors how to follow them. He's that in line with the law. And instead of railing against the Roman law, he accepts it, and he really complies with it really dutifully. And again, he's mirroring Jesus in this. I'm fascinated by the story about how Jesus condescended to pay Roman taxes because he said so as not to offend anyone. He got it out of a fish, but he still paid it so as not to offend anyone. And he submitted to the authority of Pontius Pilate because he said that it was granted to him by God. And this, of course, reminded me of what Paul says himself in Romans chapter 13, where he says, everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. For the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of the authorities? Do what is right, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants, sent for your good. But if you are doing wrong, of course you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So you must submit to them, not only to avoid punishment, but also to keep a clear conscience. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this really challenging, and I always have. Because one of the things that I love the most about God is the fact that he's absolutely just. That he offers true justice, and the Bible is full of God explaining and calling for true justice. And it's really refreshing because we don't actually often see it. And it's life-giving, like everything else he does. So I think it can be easy for believers to get weary of earthly leaders, because even the best and even the most mundane, they fall so far short of the one true judge. But there is a reason that God has not brought everything to an end yet. He's not stopped this experiment, as some people say. He's not stopped it and brought the new heaven and the new earth yet. And as Jesus prayed in John chapter 17, he said, I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong to this world any more than I do. Make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. Just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. God has placed us on this earth, this imperfect earth, and there is work for us to do. One of these jobs is to be ambassadors for him in all areas of life, and to bring his light into all areas of life, and to pray his kingdom into all areas of life, even in our dealings with authorities. I read something really interesting in the book God on Mute recently, and it really struck me. And I was like, oh, it's true. And I'd never thought about this before. It talks about how when God speaks to the devil, he is respectful. Even the devil, you see it in the book of Job. And how when Jesus spoke to demons, he was respectful. And when he answered the temptations, he was respectful. And if we are called to be God's ambassadors, then we must be respectful in our dealings with others too. Everyone. Because I think part of that is, if you don't, then you've stooped to the level. And elsewhere, Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, pray this way for kings and all who are in authority, so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives, marked by godliness and dignity. This prayer allows us, and what I like about this prayer is that it allows us to pray for leaders, whether we agree with them or whether we don't, because it's about us seeing beyond us being in the right or them being in the right or whoever's in the right. It's just praying for peace. And hopefully that is what we all want. So Paul, he respects authority. He does not fight against it. And he takes the consequences that it dishes out. But at the same time, he doesn't let those in authority off the hook either. He holds those in authority to account to the fullest extent of the law that they are meant to be upholding. Submitting to authority does not mean allowing it to be corrupt or being conformed to its corruption. Nathan, I always think of Nathan. He knew David was God's anointed, and that is why he challenged him to be everything he was meant to be worthy of his call. And Daniel served King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, but he didn't compromise his faith. And Paul respects the law of Rome and the authority of Festus by complying with their demands. But he adheres to Roman law to the letter, even more than Festus does. When Paul appeals to Caesar, he is acting within his rights. He has been patient. He has not rebelled against authorities. He has submitted to them. But now it's time to move forward. It's funny to think that the means of fulfilling Paul's calling of going to Rome was in his own hands. I find this a little bit weird. He appeals to Caesar, and that gives him a fast track to Rome. So if he was always able to do that, why didn't he do that before? He's been in captivity for 2 years. My study Bible explains that it wasn't a light thing to do. Every Roman citizen had a right to do this. But if every Roman citizen appealed to Caesar, he would not be happy about this. It was quite a precarious position to be in, because you could incur Caesar's displeasure by doing this. And whereas he'd been in prison, he could be put to death for this. But Paul had followed the correct procedure as far as it would go. And now, in order to avoid the plots of the Jews and in order to fulfill his calling, he plays his trump card. Paul's journey to fulfilling his calling, to going to Rome, is not what you call conventional. He travels there as a prisoner in the care of Roman authorities. And when I was thinking about his story, I was really reminded of Joseph's story. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, as some people call him. He was rejected. Joseph was rejected by his own, and he was wrongfully imprisoned. And he was patient and respectful of authority until eventually, by a really roundabout route, he arrives in the place that God had long ago revealed to him he would reach. He had had dreams as a child that he would have authority over his family, and in the end, he's the one who saves them. And I was wondering whether Paul was thinking about this. I wonder, he would have known Joseph's story really well. When he was in prison, did his mind think? Did he go in his mind to Joseph? It's funny to think that someone from around 2,000 years ago could have gained comfort and inspiration from Bible stories, which still offer us comfort and inspiration today. And even if he wasn't, this story has carried many people through that kind of situation. I found Joseph's story a comfort and inspiration many, many times. It's taught me about being faithful in the really small things, and about humility, and about waiting on God's promises, even when everything looks like it's going badly. And Bible truths have inspired so many over history, and I think that's a really comforting thought, and that they still do today, because the word of God is living and active. And it's such an honor and a privilege that we need to not forget to have access to these promises, to this word. But even more so, it's such an honor and a privilege to be the people who know the answer to all these questions, to recognize that his hand is moving in our lives, and to know that we can continue to grow in our understanding of him and in our role as his ambassadors. And I just love that we can see his hand in our lives, but also that we get to play a role in his story for the world. And we read about people like Paul and Joseph, but he's no less present with us, and he has good plans for us, and we get to partner with him in it. So yes, I will end with a prayer. So it's a little bit like Paul's journey. That was a bit of a woo journey, but I will just pray to finish. God, I thank you that your word is living and active. I thank you that we don't have to make this all up and muddle our way through. Instead, we've got access to your word through the Bible. but access to your presence too, and to your guiding in our lives. I thank you that you haven't given up on us. I thank you that you keep sending prophets, apostles, your son, your ambassadors all the time into this world. Sometimes we could give up on it, but you don't. And Lord, just help us, strengthen us, and equip us to be your ambassadors in all ways. And teach us to do it in the way that you would do. Thank you that you have just a respectful way, because you see the value in all that you have made. Help us to be like that too, and just to shine a light in all areas of our lives. Amen.